My radial arm saw is tuned to perfection, but it blows so much sawdust all over the place that I hate using it. In this video, I'll show you how I made a simple shroud that captures almost all the dust. At the end, I'll test how it compares to the dust collection on my crosscut sled and my Festool track saw. I watched all 7,000 YouTube videos about radial arm saw dust collection.
And if you don't believe that, you just keep on watching my tapes because we're going to show you this is true.
It seemed like the most effective designs were capturing the dust either as part of the fence itself or immediately behind it. Since I'm only going to be using this for cross-cutting at 90 degrees, I don't need anything too fancy. I wanted to retain the ability to swap out my fence for a new one whenever it gets chewed up, so I decided to make a shroud that sits right behind the fence. I took the back of the saw's table over to my workbench and started laying out a basic box to sit on top. A 6-inch wide hole centered on the blade looked right, so I calculated the surface area of a 4-inch dust collection port and figured out how tall the rectangular hole needed to be to not restrict the airflow. That turned out to be 2 inches. The fence itself protrudes 1 inch above the table, so my whole rectangular box needed to be 3 inches tall. I ripped some scraps of MDF to 3 inches and cross-cut them to the correct length with my table saw sled. I cut a scrap of 1/4-inch Luan for the lid and used a centering rule to lay out the screw positions. I line up the rule so the same reading appears on both edges, and then I can easily find a symmetrical pattern for the screw heads. I drilled out some pocket holes on the sides so I could attach the box to the table, and then fused the sides into a solid piece using CA glue. I put the lid in place and drilled pilot holes with countersinks on the marks I made previously. Once the lid was screwed down, I was able to bring the box nicely into square. Finally, I can use the pocket screws to attach it to the saw table. All my side pieces were cut and joined straight, so there's no need to use any adhesive or gasket. The seams are plenty airtight for this application. I was planning on getting a 4-inch PVC flange to screw down to the top of the box, but my local hardware store didn't have any. What they did have turned out even better. This is a galvanized steel A-collar, or start collar. I think it's also called a top collar. I'm eventually going to have a dust collection drop coming from the ceiling, so I want the port pointing straight up. I used my super ugly router circle cutting jig to bore the right size hole and bent the tabs with a hammer. The collar sits firmly in place and doesn't seem to leak at all, even without any caulking. After getting the table back on the saw, I made the initial cut through the box. I didn't account for the stiffener getting in the way, so I had to notch out a little space for that. But once the saw was sliding freely, I could already tell that the shroud was pretty effective. The only place the sawdust seems to be escaping is through the kerf in the back of the box. I used some more CA glue to add another little box behind the kerf so that the blade doesn't go all the way through. I drilled out some holes inside the back wall to try and get some airflow around the back of the blade. It seems like it helped, but I can still see some larger particles fly out. I'm already pretty convinced my shroud is really effective, but ever since watching Drew from Fisher's shop test his miter saw dust collection shroud using a kitchen scale, I've been wanting to try his technique. I'll compare how much dust is captured by my 3 different methods for crosscutting: the radial arm saw, the crosscut sled on my job site table saw, and the Festool TS55 track saw. I'll start out by thoroughly cleaning out the collection bucket. So first off is the radial arm saw. The 2x4 initially weighs 571 grams. After 25 cuts, the remaining wood weighs 451 grams, which means there was 120 grams of dust created by the saw. I then used a dustpan and brush to very carefully collect whatever dust was inside the bucket. This dust weighed 100 grams, meaning the dust collection of the radial arm saw is 81% efficient. Next is the table saw with my crosscut sled. This one started off at 495 grams. After 25 cuts, the remaining wood weighs 395 grams, so 100 grams of dust was created. The dust in the collection bucket weighed 70 grams, which means the table saw was only 70% efficient. Finally, the Festool TS55 track saw. I'm in between MFT tables at the moment, so this one is pretty wobbly. I used a slightly longer 2x4 to better clear the fence. It started off weighing 585 grams. I initially wrote this incorrectly, so ignore the 558 here. After the cuts, it weighed 484 grams, meaning about 100 grams of sawdust was created. There were 67 grams of dust inside my collection bucket, making this only 67% efficient. Now, this is obviously not really a fair test. The TS55 is designed for cutting sheet goods. When you use it on 3/4 sheet goods to make long cuts, the dust collection is probably 95% efficient. I think I've proved here that it's easy to get fantastic dust collection on a radial arm saw when you're using it for cross-cutting. Leave me a comment if you tried something similar. I'd love to hear how it worked out for you. Next up for this saw is a permanent base cabinet to replace these spindly legs, but I'll leave that for the next video. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next time.